inside my head. I try to turn it down, but I can't quite drown it out. I'm tortured.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. You're listening to Society Bites Radio, and I'm your host, Dr. Richard Himmer.
And I'm Sherry Himmer, and this is Authentically You, social interaction for the mind and soul.
For the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to talk about healing and growth from the inside out, specifically of how to find your happiness, joy, and well-being, because you're going to raise your emotional self-awareness and learn how to pre-plan the ability to stop going to fight or flight.
So last segment, we were using this case study of Bobby, whose girlfriend went off to college, and it's Christmas, and there was kind of this expectation of hearing a phone call from her, and he sees her car in the driveway, and he basically goes and starting to go into a flooded state. Seeing her car triggered him to think, oh no, what if she doesn't call me? What if she doesn't like me anymore? And he's kind of going there. So we're going to kind of pick up. I know this case study sounds like so sophomore, but I think it makes it safe because we can laugh a little bit about Bobby and Brenda.
I think I'm just laughing.
We can laugh about all those teenage self experiences that we have that we remember.
So let's differentiate between trigger and flood.
Yeah.
Trigger is a precursor to being flooded. I know that we use them synonymously. Being triggered simply is there's stimulus or stimuli that's showing up in your heart center, in your stomach, in your shoulders, in your back. You feel something long before you recognize what's going on. It's like a bogey on a radar screen. So back when I was figuring this out for the first time, I recognized that my stomach told me everything that was going on in my space. If I had an upset stomach, I needed to stop and ask, what's going on? That helped me immensely to slow the world down because I'm asking to be aware at that time. And as I've grown in this, I've just become much more competent in recognizing the stimuli in my world around me. Therefore, I'm able to modify or reduce and sometimes eliminate my process from being triggered to being flooded. And it's been really a marvelous thing, but it didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of practice, and I didn't know any of this stuff. I was just trying to figure it out. So being triggered is actually neutral. For example, by definition, when I go home from work, I'm triggered. Why? I get to see you. I get to see Sam. I look forward to it.
Positive triggers.
By definition, triggered is neutral. But because it's so used as actually being flooded, I'm going to differentiate it. And in my paper, I did that. So today, Sherry and I will differentiate a trigger from a cue.
Yes.
And we're going to continue with the Bobby and Brenda narrative to try to explain that. So when we left off last time, Bobby sees her car.
Yeah.
He's now been triggered, and he doesn't recognize that he's been triggered.
Yeah. So the trigger / cue or stimuli is the fact that he sees her car when he wasn't expecting to.
And he had expectations.
Mm-hmm.
He fully expected her to reach out and contact him at a specific time. That was never discussed. So that was completely his immaculate perception of what he wanted done. And we ended it with, it's possible that he had a negative self-belief, a false narrative, which we term a shadow.
Well, I would say that where he's going with this thoughts is evidence of maybe some insecurities and a lack of self-worth.
And what Sherry just explained was based upon experiences.
Yeah.
So these experiences that he's had at some point in his life over the time have compounded. So he's created a false narrative like I have no worth.
And I would just say generically that for teenagers, young adults who are venturing into relationships, they all kind of feel this because it's new territory.
Well said.
And it's one of the reasons why, dating after 16 is a much better idea than dating before 16 because
based on maturity.
You're emotionally not mature.
And even then at 16, they're not there. And the reality is if you don't get it when you're 16, you don't get it when you're 20, you're a basket case at 35 when you're married for 10 or 15 years. And then you're seeing someone like me because you don't know how to effectively regulate your own emotions because you're constantly living in a triggered to flooded state and you want your spouse to be the fall guy. So you blame them even though you're the one initiating all of the challenges. And then what happens when your spouse starts reciprocating that same dysfunctional behavior back? You got a whirlwind of dysfunctional behavior, and you got both parties wanting the other party to be the blame. So you got two addicted people claiming the other has to change first. That's a rough go.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've covered the fact that experiences lead to beliefs, false narrative shadows, and beliefs dictate behavior. So we're going to pick it up with where do you start going into addressing this? There are two principle-based steps to change behavior: eradicate addictions, heal relationships, and invite happiness, joy, and well-being as a constant companion. And the two are, and we're going to define these words in just a second.
Okay. So the first thing is the balancing of the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. We're talking about your brain and your body system. 2 is to integrate the upstairs brain with the downstairs brain.
And I would use plural there.
That.
The upstairs brains with the downstairs brains.
Yes.
So let's go over the definition. The sympathetic nervous and the parasympathetic nervous systems are part of the autonomic nervous system. That may not mean anything to anyone, but to some it does. The sympathetic is responsible for fight and flight. It's the active and alert part of you. Now, here's what's interesting. If that's on overload, if that's out of control, if your sympathetic isn't working right, you're in a manic state.
Or have great anxiety.
Good. So now let's go parasympathetic.
And I just want to break apart, like when you're learning these brain autonomy or anatomy terms, it's a little, I don't know, sympathetic. You want to think, oh, you're sympathizing. Has nothing to do with that. So erase that. And people associate that word with calming and sympathizing, but it's not that.
Actually, that's parasympathetic is the calm.
Yeah.
Right.
The parasympathetic is the rest and digest system, calm and relaxed, feed and breed. It's responsible for slowing the heart rate and conserving energy. It's a part of your brain that looks to like, can I eat it? Can I mate with it?
Right.
Can I calm myself with this?
Right. So what happens when it's on overdrive? You're depressed.
Yeah.
You can't get out of bed. Now, we just defined bipolar.
Yeah.
Now, isn't that fascinating that the whole process of the trigger buster is regulating bipolar?
Which is powerful for those who question or struggle with that. And we could go back and talk about our dear friend, if you go back many segments over a year ago, Ruth Taylor. She was diagnosed bipolar.
Severe.
Very severe, on a load of medications, and was able to bring that down to nothing and be successful and actually restore health in her relationship.
Ruth practiced trigger busters. She was one of the first adopters that actually did it. Mm-hmm. And what made it fascinating is she was on 13 prescribed medications and a cocaine addict. When she tragically died, the only medication she was on was for her cancer, because she had learned to regulate them. And her symptoms were pretty
they were way off severe. The charts.
Right.
Every time she would go to flood, she'd end up in the hospital.
Yeah. It was pretty severe.
Yeah.
And her doctors, when she finally figured this out and started balancing the system, even though she had no manifesting symptoms, were angry at her for not taking her bipolar meds, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Which caused her other complications and hazards for herself. So, yeah.
Okay, so we have the idea is to learn to balance the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. And this comes back to, in last segment, we talked about think, do, feel. That's what you're doing. Yeah. When you feel uncomfortable, you're out of balance, right? You take a deep breath in. You what if I can feel fine? What if I can get through this? What if I'm strong enough? What if I'm whatever it might be? Because you're thinking it, then you act. You do something really quick, something innocuous. You just put yourself in motion. That moves the body, the active and alert, brings it into balance with the calm and relaxed, and now you feel differently. That's kind of like the little baby brother of trigger busters, the think, do, and feel. You're simply being aware of what's going on in your space. Then now number 2, integrate the upstairs and downstairs brains. So let's define upstairs brains.
The upstairs brains are the cognitive section of your brain and represent about 10% of total functionality impact. The downstairs brains are the subconscious section and account for 90% of total functionality and impact. And the downstairs brains, why we talk about the downstairs brain, it's all your primary organs below your neck.
Right. So being mindful of it, and I've had this you and I have talked about this on the podcast, my constant vigilance with engineer mindset people. They're afraid of their emotions. And so they get dictated by their emotions, despite the fact that they're cognitively not aware that they are being dictated by those emotions. And they also create a huge ripple effect with family members, children, daughters and sons and spouses. When they feign to think that intellectually they can solve the world's problems and get through without emotion, they do a tremendous amount of damage.
Yeah, so the 10%, 90% is really realizing that, yes, 10%, we like to think of our cognitive brain as the one in control, but if you don't have control of your downstairs brains, right, if you aren't balancing those, they will override you. And that's what's happening in a flooded state,
right,
is that all those opiates and chemicals, adrenaline and all of that is rushing to muscle groups, to your heart, to your respiratory system, and it's creating havoc that causes for time to create a de-escalation. That's why it can't happen immediately.
I remember an argument between a husband and wife once, and he was arguing that, well, I don't understand why you have to get us so emotional. And then she looked at me and says, yeah, he never raises his voice when we get an argument. It's just really kind of monotone going on. And then I explained, but his words are biting, are they not? And she would go, yes. And I looked at him and I explained, I said, sir, you're as flooded as she is. You're manifesting it differently. You know how to be on the outside, calm and relaxed, but your words are tearing her apart, and your lack of connecting to her is tearing her apart. You're completely driven by your downstairs brains, despite the fact that on the outside, the world would say that you're calm. You are not. You're a raging river of lava on the inside, and you're ripping your wife and the relationship between her to shreds. That was a revelation. Just because you're calm on the outside, you can use big words or you can have a monotone voice, doesn't mean that you're not flooded.
Interesting point.
So, okay. The process of accomplishing the 2 steps requires you to discover your authentic self, your identity. There's a system for that. Process past trauma, a system for that. Develop habits that create a new habitat by...
Oh, it's so important to use an awareness journal. In fact, you've always said the clients that have success are those that do the awareness journal.
Do it correctly.
Do it
I have
correctly.
many clients who do it, but not all clients do it correctly.
We've got several segments on how to do it.
Right.
Mindfulness, trigger busters, which we are starting to unveil. What if protocol.
And we've talked about the what if in the think, do, feel, right?
Yep.
What if?
Pre-planning behavior.
Which is where that's the best place to do it, is in mindfulness.
Yep. Self-advocating.
Prioritize yourself.
Civility with boundaries, which is...
Stop being a nice guy.
Rules of engagement.
Yeah, be kind, yeah.
Awareness, acceptance, and empathy. And living a perfect life, meaning that perfect is an event or experience that exactly what you need to come closer to integration. It does not mean perfection.
Right.
Perfect is the mistake that gets the retake, and that's how we learn. That's how we actually are successful. And if we look at anyone who's tried to invent anything or create something, they've had a whole lot of retakes to get there. And that's always the interesting part of anyone's story.
That's probably going to be a fun segment someday to discuss the difference between perfect, perfected, and perfectionism. Anyway, so let's continue going. The next step would be deliberate practice.
Yep. And develop the ability to name dysfunctional, maladaptive behaviors without judging, like staying neutral, especially with yourself. Develop some effective communication skills and your emotional intelligence.
We've used the term deliberate practice in the past. Let me give you a quick definition of that. Deliberate practice refers to a special type of practice that's purposeful and systematic. It requires focused attention to detail and often chunks the effort into measured parts. It's used to pre-plan and prepare for conditions of satisfaction. One of my conditions of satisfaction is that my relationships are based on trust and respect.